Welcome, everyone. My name is Jordana Gessler, and I am the Vice President of Education and Exhibits at Holocaust Museum LA, the first and oldest survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the United States. We were founded in 1961 by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to create a safe place to display their precious artifacts, to remember their family members and loved ones who had perished, and to educate future generations on the important lessons of the Holocaust. Today, the museum continues to provide free Holocaust education to students from across Los Angeles, the United States, and the world, fulfilling the mission of our founders to commemorate, educate, and inspire. Thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation with Holocaust scholar and author Joshua M. Greene about his latest book, Unstoppable, Siggi B. Wilzig, Astonishing Journey from Auschwitz Survivor and Penniless Immigrant to Wall Street Legend. After surviving Auschwitz and hunting Nazis for the US Army, Sigi came to America without a penny to his name. On arrival, he made 3 vows: to never go hungry again, to support the Jewish people, and to speak out against injustice. From humble beginnings, shoveling snow and laboring in sweatshops, Sigi became president, chairman, and CEO of a New York Stock Exchange listed oil company and grew a full-service commercial bank to more than $4 billion in assets. Sigi's ascent is a riveting story of grit, cunning, luck, and the determination to live life to its fullest. We are so honored to welcome author Joshua M. Greene to talk to us about this incredible story and his work writing the book. Joshua M. Greene is a renowned Holocaust scholar and filmmaker whose biographies have sold more than 500,000 copies worldwide. Greene is a popular lecturer who has spoken at the Pentagon and before the Judge Advocate General's College, and his documentaries on Holocaust history have aired on PBS and Discovery. He's appeared on national media outlets from NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross to Fox News, CNN, and more. Before we get started, please note that you will have the opportunity to ask questions. You can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It is now my pleasure to welcome Joshua. Joshua, thank you so much for joining us today. Please share a little bit about the short film we will see and the program that we will listen to.
Right, well, thank you, Jordana. It's an honor to be here. We'll start with a short video. It's a 4-minute piece that allows you to hear Sigi speak in his own words. You'll see him as he was videotaped toward the end of his life in November and December of 2002 by a crew from the Spielberg Shoah Foundation. He's revealing things in these brief moments that you'll see that he had not spoken of earlier in his life. And it was an opportunity to begin our time together this evening with Sigi presenting himself and a little bit of his story in his own words.
The longer I live, the more I remember. I'm trying to get away from the past, but it isn't possible. I am not liberated yet. I live in Auschwitz every day.
I was born in 26 in Koyanke. It was West Prussia, about 155 miles northeast of Berlin. In 35, we left everything, and the next morning we were in Berlin. Kristallnacht, I was 12 years old as a child, and you see synagogues burn. Jewish homes go up in flames, and the police not doing anything. It was like the end of the world. They called it evacuation. That was the word. When the trains pulled up, I looked out of the window. I know we were going east. But going east didn't mean Auschwitz. We didn't know there was an Auschwitz. How do you survive 2 years of Auschwitz? It was not my education, which I didn't have any. It was my brain, which I didn't have much. It was the hand of God. What did I do next? I acquired control of Wilshire Oil Company of Texas, a little oil company. I bought it piece by piece by piece by piece. I was only the second Jew to become a president of a bank.
What kinds of nightmares do you have?
Very bad. It's something that is there. You are in Auschwitz every day. I wouldn't want to be anything else. If I would have to go through, God forbid, the same thing, I would go through the same thing as a Jew.
So Joshua, before we get into the conversation about Sigi and the book Unstoppable, I believe you have a few pages that you would like to share from the book.
I'd like to read just a brief passage that should give you a sense of what it was like for Sigi when he first arrived in New York. It was a bitter winter in 1947. There was a blizzard. There was the biggest blizzard in about 50 years. So he arrives here under very stressful conditions. He's 21 years old. As you heard him describe, he had no money, no education. Schools had been closed to Jewish children by the time he was sent to Auschwitz. But he arrives in America, and the HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, had arranged for rooms in a rundown hotel in Harlem called Hotel Marseille. So this passage takes place when Sigi is finally in his room, the first room of his own that he's had in his entire life, and he's looking down on the street below. Below his window, weary pedestrians fought driving winds and 6-foot-high snowdrifts, evoking for Sigi harsh memories of other blazing storms when starving men and women trudged forward on death marches wearing nothing more than thin prisoner uniforms. Traffic in the New York streets snarled and drivers honked their horns, impatient to get wherever they were going. Even to a 21-year-old newcomer like Sigi, it was clear that Americans, who had never known the inside of a concentration camp, were alive in every sense, moving purposefully forward towards some vision of tomorrow. He liked that. He would do that too, grasp opportunities and not allow the darkness of the past to rob him of a bright future. In that seminal moment of his new life, Sigi made 3 promises to himself. First, he would never go hungry again. Second, he would marry a Jewish woman, have children, and help rebuild the Jewish people. Third, he would preserve Holocaust memory and speak up whenever he witnessed injustice. He had no illusions about such vows. He knew better than to think he could change the world. Anti-Semitism would never go away, and Jews would always be persecuted. That was just business as usual. Still, the Almighty had saved him, and now his job was to grab whatever scraps remained from the rubble of his life and cobble them back together into an edifice of yet to be determined size and shape. You have a little bit of a glimpse of someone who had to grow up very quickly. You know, the anti-Semitism in West Prussia in the early 30s was quite pronounced. Sigi describes having to run away quite often from the other kids who were Jew haters and ready to beat him up. And so he hung out more with adults, watched how they made decisions in business, how they played cards. And so from an early life, he was honing his, what he called fox-like intuitions, what to do, where to go, where not to go, what to say, what not to say. And he exercised those skills when he was finally deported to Auschwitz.
So backing up a little bit, how did you first come across the story of Sigi?
I was introduced to Sigi's eldest son. Sigi had 3 children. His oldest child is Ivan Wilzig, who read some of my books and said, "I think you're the one who should write my father's story." And at that point I said, "You know, I don't think so, thank you very much, but it's too much darkness." I had done about a dozen survivor biographies at that point. And I was walking around the house in such probably a touch of clinical depression that my wife said, "You've got to find something else to write about." And so I did. I wrote a biography of the late Beatle George Harrison, which was a lot of fun. But when this came up and I was having this conversation with Ivan, I said, "Too much darkness. I want to go toward the light." Ivan almost screamed at me on the phone. He said, "You don't understand. My father was the light. He was a torch, a beacon of hope and light for every immigrant coming to America." So I did a little research, and Ivan was not exaggerating. His father really was as extraordinary as Ivan claimed. And the more I learned about him, the more I said, you know, this is a story that deserves to be told.
So you talked a little bit about George Harrison being a fun biography, and the Holocaust memoirs that you've written, or the Holocaust biographies that you've written, been a little bit dark. Why do you choose to continue working in the field of Holocaust education and continue writing these often dark, heavy, upsetting biographies?
Good question. As unexpected as it may seem, there are some connections between the spiritual journey that you learn about and embark upon when you enter into contemplative practices, yoga, meditation, and so on, and the field of Holocaust historiography. For example, both deal with the retrieval of suppressed memory. In the yoga culture, the suppressed memory is the entrance of Atma, or life, into the world of birth and death. And that experience is so traumatic that it has been suppressed. We don't remember anything earlier than the one lifetime that we're living. In Holocaust history, particularly when you deal with witness testimony, you're also dealing with suppressed memory, of course, of a much grimmer kind, namely traumatic memory of humiliation, starvation, and murder, and torture. And very often witnesses to the Holocaust, if they agree to give their testimony, sometimes they'll begin by speaking in almost a kind of third person. You'll hear a witness say, well, she was over there, she did that, as though detached from the person she was in those horrible years. And if the testimony is being conducted by people who are properly trained in the field of witness testimony, it becomes a safe space, a comfortable space, and the witness, gradually you will see a uniting of these disparate, broken selves until the person is again speaking in the first person. And sometimes you'll even see in the face of the individual these memories returning. There was quite a bit of that as I screened Siggi's testimony for the Shoah Foundation. It was quite evident that he was back there. He was beginning to relive some of those suppressed memories. So, as strange as it may sound, what is it that engages us? It's stories, it's journeys. Some journeys are darker than others. Certainly, survivors, witnesses to the Holocaust do not have a pretty story to tell. But it's all about inching our way slowly forward toward a more enlightened, self-aware life.
And I think there's also a lot of opportunity for us to learn lessons from traumatic events. And so having witnesses share and writing biographies allows us to access the history in a way that informs us on how to perhaps create a more dignified world. Working with traumatic memory, which I know can often, you were talking about how survivors sometimes remove themselves from the story or speak about themselves in second person as sort of a form of resiliency. I know that sometimes traumatic memory can be non-sequential. So how do you work with creating a chronological order of events? How much research goes into, or additional research goes into these biographies, or in the case of Sigi specifically, in addition to just collecting and writing their story?
Right, another good question. And biographers have a very challenging assignment. They have to condense a life, an entire life, into 200, 300 pages, which is unfair to the subject of the biography. You can't do that. But you can be judicious in your choice of beats of a person's life story. And if you have some literary skill, you can weave those moments together into a narrative that brings readers inside the subject's life. That was, for me, the challenge in every one of the biographies that I've been asked to do or chose to do. More often than not, when you deal with Holocaust survivors, the assignment for the writer is to not demonstrate outstanding writing skills. The responsibility is to step out of the way and allow the survivor to speak in his or her own words. Now, because survivors are not historians necessarily, there's a difference between screening video testimony and reading a book. In the book, there's an opportunity to fill in the missing pieces. And that was a big part of writing Unstoppable. Describing, for example, anti-Semitism in post-war America, describing the situation during the war years in Europe. What was it that Sigi was going into when he arrived at Auschwitz? It's wrong to assume that the readership or the viewership, in the case of a documentary, actually knows anything about the Holocaust. I mean, it's stunning how little people actually know. No doubt your members and the viewers of this program are advantaged by a deeper education, a deeper awareness of the Holocaust period. Most people have no clue. I know even in college courses, I'll get questions that shock me from college students. Here are some examples. These are actual questions. Professor Greene, in Auschwitz, what do they do on weekends? Was the food kosher? I had one young man in a freshman course ask me, in the concentration camps, did they have gyms? I mean, that's how clueless, particularly young people, are, for whom the Holocaust is something that happened 1 million years ago. It's ancient history. It happened to people who lived in countries where they speak a different language. They have these incomprehensible accents, and the stories are unbelievable. It's not unusual, even for survivors, to say, I cannot believe what my eyes have seen. So maybe it's not so shocking that young people for whom there is no connection with this dark time in history would doubt the stories they're hearing. So it's a very challenging thing to create a background of enough information so that uninitiated readers know what you're talking about, but it doesn't become didactic, scholarly. It needs to be a literary nonfiction piece so that people will want to continue reading, and that was the challenge for me with Unstoppable.
I mean, it sounds like a challenge because you're both educating the public about history, giving space for the survivor's story, all within the confines of 300 pages. I know that you also have written books for children, and you teach classes for young adults and obviously write books for adults. How do you make the choices or what is your approach when you're making the choices for your audience? What do you consider? How is your style different when you're writing for a kid or a teenager or someone who's older?
Well, the Holocaust-related children's books that I've done have all been for Scholastic. The most recent one is called Signs of Survival. It's about a woman named Renee Hartman who grew up in a family in Bratislava where both parents were deaf and where her younger sister was deaf. And Renee was the hearing person in her family, so that when she heard the boots of the Nazi officers coming up the stairs of their apartment building, she would sign to her family that we have to go hide now. Scholastic has very clear guidelines about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable for middle grade readers. For example, there are no descriptions of atrocities, even though in Renee's video testimony for the Fortunoff Video Archive or Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University, she's quite candid in her descriptions of being in Bergen-Belsen, and right outside the barrack where she and her sister were staying was a charnel house with piles of bodies stacked up taller than she and her sister were. That would be deemed inappropriate for a Scholastic book for middle grade readers. Similarly, in another book called Survival, the young woman protagonist there had an affair with a Ukrainian policeman as a way of simply keeping her family alive, because this policeman would bring food and so on and not give them away from where they were hiding. That was also not appropriate for middle grade readers. It was described as boyfriend and girlfriend. So there are some considerations in that regard. Of course, when it's an adult book like Unstoppable, I guess as I think about it, the only consideration there was there were certain curse words I think that we avoided because we did want the book to be acceptable in educational settings. And in a high school, for example, there are certain states, as we're learning all too clearly lately, where there are guidelines and restrictions. So we were a little careful about the language there. The job was facilitated by the fact that Siggi Wilzig himself taught himself so much about the Holocaust that he was a scholar of the subject. And so he was able, in his presentations, he gave hundreds of lectures in his lifetime, school groups and business groups, and he was the first survivor to address cadets and officers at West Point Military Academy. He had educated himself through documentary films and so on, and was able to describe in extraordinary detail things that he probably was unaware of even when he was in Auschwitz. So the book was facilitated by Sigi himself.
So when you talking a little bit more about Siggy's experiences, it sounds also that when you write for children, you focus more on stories of hiding and not in concentration camps. And obviously Siggy's story does take him to Auschwitz. I heard in the video, he said, "I am not liberated yet. I live in Auschwitz every day." And working with so many Holocaust survivors as you have, what do you think he means by this? And how do you think that shapes who he was as a person and who shapes many of the survivors?
Yeah. Professor Lawrence Langer has written quite eloquently about this subject in his Critics Circle award-winning book, Holocaust Testimony, The Ruins of Memory. Memory for witnesses to the Holocaust is not old memory. It's living memory. It's something that does not go away. That's difficult for us to understand because, I mean, if it's in the past, can't you just leave it behind and move on? I mean, that's the American way, isn't it? You know, we soldier on, you know, it's un-American actually to say that no, we're still living in sadness. You know, that there's some kind of compulsion in our culture to get over tragedy, to move on, to move past the darkness of history. And of course, survivors, when they first came to America in the post-war years, they couldn't find an audience to tell their stories to. Nobody wanted to hear them. They wanted to get on with their life. They were over the rationing and sad years of the war, and then now let's move on. And it's, you know, 2 cars in the garage and 3 chickens in every pot, and we don't want to hear that stuff. But it took a while for witnesses to gain a platform where their experiences became important to our understanding of history. It probably got its first impetus with the Eichmann trials in the early 60s, which were broadcast worldwide and which focused on survivor testimony. You know, the Nuremberg trials were putting people to sleep because Chief Justice Robert Jackson chose to emphasize paper documentation in his prosecution of these top Nazi honchos who were on trial at Nuremberg. And it was boring. The judges on the bench were falling asleep. When the Eichmann trial took place, having seen what had happened at Nuremberg, the prosecution made the conscious decision to use testimony by survivors as a way of bringing to life the horrors that this accused was accused of, and then later found guilty, of course. And Sigi was masterful at that. He was able to articulate his experiences in a way that was absolutely mesmerizing. People would tell me that his oratory skills were as pronounced as his wicked sense of humor. He was kind of a cross between Shakespeare and Jackie Mason or something, where if he couldn't get you with a good punchline, he'd get you with a good story about what he went through in Auschwitz. And I think it's critical now that the survivor generation is all but gone, that we acknowledge the importance of survivor testimony and memoirs such as Sigi's story in Unstoppable.
So how do you think his experiences, I know you mentioned before how anti-Semitism as a child, even before the Nazis came to power, forced him to spend a lot of time with adults, shaping his critical thinking skills. But how do you think his experiences during the Holocaust, both during Kristallnacht and in Auschwitz, shaped who he was as a person to become this extraordinary legend and businessman?
Right, we have to be a little cautious here. Yes, it's a fact that Siggi Wilzig arrived in America in 1947 at age 21 with no money, no education beyond grade school, no sponsorships or business support or financial backing. And by the time he was done, 40 years later, he had built a business empire in oil and banking with assets of more than $4 billion. And very often in these author interviews, people will say, how did you do that? And it's tempting to say, well, you know, he had these very acute survival skills that kept him alive in Auschwitz. And then he got to America and he applied those same, you know, fearless skills in business. You know, he stood up to the Gestapo, and so he could certainly stand up to anti-Semitic business people in oil and banking. And there may be some truth to that, but we can't say for certain. The first thing we know is that survivors themselves will tell you that, as you heard Sigi say, he didn't survive because he was a genius or he was so cunning that he knew how to dupe concentration camp guards. I do believe that there was some agency. I differ with some scholars in this regard who say that the prisoners inside Hitler's camps had no agency over their lives. What kind of agency did they have? If you objected to someone, to a guard who was about to kill someone by trying to stop him, 10 seconds later, you would be murdered. What kind of agency is that? So I appreciate that and understand that perspective. But the reason I wrote this book is that in Sigi, I saw something that I do not think we can afford to turn away from, namely a proactive position where he refused to allow the enormity of the circumstances around him to rob him of applying his intuitions, his instincts, to try to do something to survive. He once said that, and he wasn't the only one to say this, that those prisoners who thought they were going to die, pretty much they were already dead. He didn't think like that. Now, there were a lot of people who also had the same kind of will to live and the same kind of moxie and so on who didn't make it. So you can't make a generalization about this. That's what I'm trying to say. We have to be cautious about generalizing that this worked in the camps, that did not work in the camps. I mean, there have been many very popular books. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People, that attempt to find a formula of some kind for survival, a survivor syndrome of some kind that unifies survivors in a common experience. And we don't really find that. The more you look at survivor testimony, the more you see individual men, women, and children who came out of this experience with their own very unique and personal reactions, and they were very different, one person from the next.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned earlier about how it wasn't really until the Eichmann trial when survivor testimony found space in the social conscience to even be shared. And I know you also mentioned that in the US, there was and still continues to be this idea that you have to leave that behind. Like, you're in America now, your past is your past. As I mentioned earlier, Holocaust Museum LA was founded in 1961 by a group of survivors here in LA who wanted to create a space to commemorate and to educate. And really, it's unique when you look at the historiography of the Holocaust for survivors to be sharing. When did Sigi start sharing his story?
Well, probably from the first moment he arrived in America. But certainly he ramped up his educator role when he started getting successful in business, because then he had a position of influence, of money, of some say in helping his customers in his bank and so on to increase their interest rates and profitability and so on. That's why he was, in some regards, such a workaholic. It wasn't about becoming rich. The money was a means to an end for him. The money was a way of establishing a platform so that when he spoke about his experiences, when he spoke about Holocaust history, people would have to listen. And it worked. He became one of the most outspoken advocates for Holocaust education and Holocaust memory in recent decades. And I believe there's something in this that speaks to us today. And I don't want to get political here, but I think we can all remember the footage from January 6th, where the rioters storming the Capitol building, some of them wearing T-shirts with the words Camp Auschwitz emblazoned on. This is not ancient history. The sadness and the bitterness and the violence that we've been seeing in this country recently are bred out of the bigotry, the racism, the anti-Semitism that has plagued humanity since day one. And it is why Holocaust education is so critical. You know, there are people who say, you know, I've had enough, I'm Holocaust fatigue, I really don't want anymore. Well, fine, that's your prerogative. But it's naive and dangerously so. Because if you want to understand anything about human nature, if you want to understand anything about the country we live in today, if you want to understand anything about why things are so eerily reminiscent in the United States and in Europe of conditions from the 1930s, you can't avoid studying the Holocaust.
What aspects specifically of written in Unstoppable or of Siggi's story do you think speak to that and invite readers to think critically about their surroundings?
Well, certainly the part of the book that describes when he stepped away from teaching, that was because of Reagan's visit to Bitburg Cemetery in the 90s. Chancellor Kohl and President Reagan had decided that this would be a grand gesture of the unity between these two countries if together they visited the cemetery where there were soldiers, German soldiers buried. What Reagan refused to admit, although there's evidence that he knew, was that there were also SS officers buried there. The idea of an American president laying a commemorative wreath on the tombstones of SS officers was more than Siggi Wilzig could bear. He went on air, he went on the Barry Farber radio show, and vehemently speaking out about how this must not be allowed to happen. Of course, it did happen. But when it happened, Siggi stopped talking about the Holocaust. He turned down lectures. He turned down invitations to speak. When he came back to the platform for teaching was when denial was on the rise. When Holocaust denial was resurgent in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, that's when he said, how can I not talk about what I know? People are denying the reality of this. They're denying that I saw my father die in front of me. They're denying that 59 members of my family were murdered. They're denying that this number on my arm was tattooed inside Camp Auschwitz. And it was more than he could bear. So he went back to very active speaking work at that.
And so I'm going to open it up for audience questions as well. We have a question here about regarding the fact that younger generations are thinking that World War II and the Holocaust are so long ago that there's no connection. When you teach and when you write, do you ever bring in other genocides that have happened either in the 20th century or are happening now to help generations understand what you're talking about, and or to encourage them to get involved in speaking up and out to help present victims of concentration camps and stuff. So do you use contemporary genocide or other examples of genocide in your teaching to help students sort of understand the critical necessity of studying the Holocaust?
A tricky question. Tricky because it's almost irresistible to want to make the Holocaust relevant to young people today, and what better way to do that than bring in current situations of conflict, ongoing genocides in the world. The risk there is making the Holocaust an example of some larger theme. You know, man's inhumanity to man, another genocide. It's not another genocide. The Holocaust was sui generis, in a category of its own. And there's this spate of programs going on in schools and libraries to use the Holocaust to teach some other kind of lesson. And there are scholars, and I guess I have to count myself among them, who see that as dangerous. That, are there general things that you can learn about the Holocaust? Certainly, we learn, for example, how easy it is for people to go along with murderous policies. We see how easy it is for neighbors to turn against neighbor when the circumstances favor to their benefit. We see how easily a population can be demonized, and how another population can be weaponized against them through propaganda and demagoguery. I mean, there are lots of things that we can learn from the Holocaust that may have application elsewhere. I don't think it's a good idea, personally, to broaden the perspective of Holocaust education to the point where it becomes Holocaust and human rights, Holocaust and genocide, Holocaust and the dignity of human beings, because then you begin to lose the specificity of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored, scientifically designed murder of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its allies. Were there other minorities also targeted by the Nazis? Yes. Only the Jews for total extinction. I think that's important in its own right to study. And, for example, I've retired from teaching at Hofstra, but if someone was teaching a course at Hofstra on African American history, for example, we just had Black History Month, I don't remember anyone ever standing up and saying, if we're going to teach Black history, we should also teach Irish history. We should also teach the history of the Italian Americans. We need to broaden this out to include this greater scope of the immigrant experience in America. Somehow, that distinction seems to be reserved for the Holocaust, and I don't quite understand why, except perhaps if people think that too much focus on the Holocaust as a Jewish experience becomes a pretext for attempting to stimulate sympathy for the state of Israel, or for some other peripheral reason. But personally, I think the Holocaust should be studied as the Holocaust. I don't see any need to water it down by trying to include other histories.
It's a really interesting perspective. Thank you. So a few more questions from the audience. We have one that says, and it's about denial. And I know that denial, a Holocaust denial specifically, comes in different forms, right? It's not always the denial of none of these things existed. But so a question from the audience is, how can people see pictures of what happened in the Holocaust? How can they hear the German government themselves admit that it happened and continue to deny it And what do you think the purpose of this denial is?
Right. Well, deniers will call themselves not deniers. They call themselves revisionists. They say, oh, we don't deny that there was many Jews were killed and so on, but it wasn't as bad as the Jews are making out. So they're revising the depth and scale of the final solution. And you're absolutely right. You know, it's interesting. If it was just a fringe group of crazies, of stupid people saying, well, it could never have happened, anything on that scale that doesn't make any sense, you could understand that. But when intelligent people, I mean, you know, David Irving, who was found guilty of denial when brought to court by Deborah Lipstadt in England, was, up until that time, a fairly respected historian. Then something creeped in, and he used his position as a historian and author to revise or deny the Holocaust. And when you study the arguments, of course, they don't hold up. You know, the so-called evidence that they have that, well, there were no gas chambers, we don't see any flaming pits with the airplane photography was taken. None of it holds up to scrutiny. But you begin to ask yourself, why would people who are educated, who should know better, deny the reality of something that is so vastly documented? The Holocaust is the most documented event in human history. And you have to go, it's a question that needs to be answered by psychologists, by sociologists, right? By people who understand something about the motivations behind anti-Semitism and hatred. It has nothing to do with history. It has to do with an emotional response. And I'm neither a therapist nor a sociologist, so I can't give you a comprehensive answer here. But it is a subject that we are still studying and still learning about. Where does this hatred come from? You know, there's one survivor of Buchenwald who was 12 years old in the camp, who tells the following story. He says, at one time I was walking by a guard, and the guard hit me with his rifle very hard. And he put me into a state of semi-consciousness. And a while later, when I finally came to, I asked myself, he doesn't know me. I don't know him. Why does he hate me so much? Where does this hatred come from? And he then describes that the murders that took place in the camp, remember, these are the memories of a 12-year-old. He says there was a clean way of killing and there was a brutal way of killing. He says, I could never understand the brutality. It's a profound and troubling subject. Why this ongoing deep animosity toward Jews? It's not a question that we're going to be able to answer fully here tonight.
Another question from the audience about the title. What was your motivation between choosing the title Unstoppable?
We went through about 100 different titles. Fearless, unbelievable. It's like a lot of adjectives that we went through here. Unstoppable kind of sums up. I mean, you got look at the expression on this man's face, right? This is 21-year-old Siggi Wilzig coming to America. Look at that posture, right? With the little bit of money he earned working for the CIC or whatever, he bought himself this lovely overcoat, right? He came to America because he knew that looking good could save your life. In the camps, if you pinched your cheek and you looked like you had a little energy, it might save you. So he came over here looking good. He wanted to look good. He was unstoppable. There wasn't anything that would stop him. I won't give away all of the drama of the story, but at one point, the Federal Reserve tried to get Sigi to divest either his bank or his oil and gas company. It was a time of runaway inflation, and it was thought that companies that are not banking companies owning banks is a conflict of interest. It's putting the depositors' money at risk and so on. So 399 other parent companies of banks had already divested. Sigi was the only holdout. So the Federal Reserve told him, either you divest yourself of your bank or your oil company, or there will be consequences. This was in Washington at the Fed's office. Sigi took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeve, showed them his tattoo from Auschwitz, and he said, the last person to try to intimidate me was Hitler. He didn't succeed, and neither are you. He put his coat back on, went back to New York, and beat the Fed at their own game. I won't tell you how he did it. You got to read the book.
That, I mean, really does speak what you said earlier about his character, about the Holocaust, and also his humor. I think that kind of speaks to that.
Yeah, and nothing would stop it. There wasn't any force, any power. I mean, the kinds of odds that he came up against, post-war America, the anti-Semitism in business was crazy. You couldn't find a Jew in the oil business. There were maybe one Jew in banking. He took over two companies that were traded on the stock exchange and built them into a $4 billion empire. Go figure.
Yeah, I remember when I was watching The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and her mother's character goes to visit her family in the oil, and I was like, there are Jews in oil? So we have another question from the audience. I think, in the last few minutes, put in your questions now so we can get to them. And this question is really about, how do you think, and you are an educator, you are a historian in addition to being a writer. So how do you think we can get the next generation of American students or the American public to learn the lessons from the Holocaust?
Well, whatever you do, don't be boring. You can have the most important truths of history, but if they're presented in an uninteresting way, no one, particularly young people, are going to be interested. So, the farther we move away from the events of history, the more inevitably the Holocaust will be assimilated into the arts. Film, certainly. We've seen this, deluge of Holocaust films, books and novels, music, poetry, dance, paintings, you name it. I think it's critically important that we take advantage of the imagination, artistic expression, as points of entry for people into the experience that only those who were there can understand. I'll give you an example. In a short story by a survivor of Auschwitz named Tadeusz Borowski, he has two characters talking about hunger. And one character says to the other, Tadek, you want to know what hunger is? Hunger is when you look at another human being as something to eat. Now, when you hear that, that gives you a portrait of hunger that no historian could describe in terms as gripping or as memorable. But a writer in a short story can depict circumstances in a way that engages us emotionally, creatively, intellectually, to the point where we're going to want to know more. So I think that's probably a very important dimension of the future of Holocaust memory, is in the creative field.
And really connecting, I think, in an empathetic response between people who we're learning from and who are the learners. So sort of our final question is, what's next for Unstoppable? Are there any plans for film adaptation? I know that you've worked in film before. What are the next steps for this story?
Well, I'm delighted to report that as of about 3 weeks ago, there's a 30-page lesson plan created around Siggi Wilzig's story that has been introduced into middle grade classes across the state of Florida, so that Siggi's story becomes a vehicle for Holocaust education in junior and senior high schools. That same lesson plan has been being introduced now in other states around the country. So that's one very bright development for its future. There are plans for television series that if that happens, we'll talk about it again. You never know with film and television, that's a dicey business. But there's been certainly interest in it. And there are ongoing lectures and talks and signings that are booked through next summer, if I remember correctly. So that'll be available around the country as well.
Wow, a lot of exciting opportunities, I think, to continue sharing Unstoppable and Siggi's story. Thank you, Joshua, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA and the audience, for sharing your time, your expertise, reminding us the importance of hearing from the witnesses, whether it be in books or, you mentioned the Shoah Foundation and Fortunoff oral histories, reminding us the importance of survivor testimony in Holocaust education. It's been a really rewarding and rich conversation. I'm sure many people in the audience, if they haven't gotten their copy of Unstoppable, will definitely look to receive it or to purchase it or to borrow it. And, continue hearing Siggi's story and continue reading this incredible work that you created. Before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join us virtually on Thursdays at 11 a.m. for our weekly Holocaust survivor talks. Today we heard from Leah Raziner, and next week we'll hear from survivor Henry Slucky. The museum makes available every single Thursday at 11 Pacific an opportunity to hear from a Holocaust survivor, a witness to this history, as we've been talking about today. You can also join us on Sunday, February 13th, for a special 2G program featuring our 2G chairs in conversation with the filmmakers of a short film, Ganef, which explores the intergenerational trauma between a Holocaust survivor and her daughter, set in the UK in the 60s. You can find more information about our virtual events on our website, holocaustmuseumla.org or hmla.org. Also, a recording of this program will be made available on the Holocaust Museum LA's YouTube page. So after you read Unstoppable, if you want to go back and listen to Joshua's take on the book, we highly recommend checking that out. Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's at no charge. If you are enjoying our programs, please consider supporting our work by becoming a member. To learn more about our membership levels and benefits, visit our website. Thank you again, Joshua, and for all of you for joining. Take care. We hope to see you again soon. Joshua, this has been really enriching. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.